Yea, that no righteousness within us is sufficient, no matter how deep it is. That you and I, because of the fact that we might be able to live in a decent, kind, compassionate way, those are good things, but none of those are sufficient such that we can stand before God and say we belong to Him. So with that in mind, let's look at this text. I'll begin reading in verse 12. Therefore, we are debtors, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, and then you will live. For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, these are the children of God. And you didn't receive the spirit of bondage again to fear. You received the Spirit of adoption, by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. The Spirit Himself bears witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. And if children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with Him, that we may also be glorified with Him together. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which will be revealed in us. For the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly awaits for the revealing of the children of God. The creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of God, who subjected it in hope. Because the creation itself will also be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now. Not only that, but we who also have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our bodies. For we were saved in this hope. But hope that is seen is not hope. For why does one still hope for what one sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we eagerly wait for it with perseverance. There's a huge historical backdrop here for this text. The metaphor that Paul uses is the metaphor of adoption. And that metaphor really doesn't come home to us in this century. It just does not. In the Roman system, though, the readers of this letter, or the hearers of it being read in a church congregation in the Roman Empire, they would have understood this metaphor very, very well. In the Roman system, adoption was a very difficult process and very ceremonially connected. There is a term in Latin, and it would be spoken. It was part of the legal system of Rome at the time in which Paul writes this. The term is, in Latin, patria potestas. And you say, well, what does that mean? It means the Father's rule is absolute. Period. Now, that means a lot more than it means in our day. When we think about a patristic society, which unfortunately the whole world is fairly patristic still to this day. We don't yet have the egalitarian nature that the garden shows us, where the two humans were side by side. We still have a lot of over and under things going on. All that aside, that's nothing compared to what the Roman reader would have understood this to mean at their time. The Father's control went far greater. It was a far greater control than, say, what color the drapes are going to be, or whether or not we're going to live in a 250 square foot house or a 1,400 square foot house, or whether we're going to have tile on the floor or whatever. Way past that. Or whether we're going to have 8 children or 6 children or 3 children. None of those are minor points. The Father's control was absolute to the point of life and death. In the Roman system, it was absolutely legal for the Father to make life and death decisions over the people in His home. Now, you say, well, what does that mean? Well, think about it. If you go back and do a cursory study of the Roman Empire, you will find some of the writers who chronicled that era writing about the fact that you could go down the Appian Way, or you could pass by the Roman Forum or the Colosseum, and you would hear babies crying at night. Why were they out there crying at night? Because the father in the home had deemed them not fit to live, and they were left to exposure. Now think about what that means. The father, the wife becomes pregnant, the father decides we can't afford another child. And so there's no sense of let's go through the process of adoption. No, the Father's rule was absolute to the point of life and death. when the baby's born, we're going to take it to the forum and leave it for the wild animals or whatever becomes of it. And that was, look, we go, oh, that's terrible. For the Roman Empire, uncontroversial. Wasn't even really questioned. It wasn't until the time of Jesus coming that these things became controversial. That's very important. We forget that. So the son, this goes back to where we're going with this adoption picture today. The children were the father's possession. They weren't people that just were autonomously born into the world like we raise children today. The father owned them. And they never outgrew the father's ownership until the father died. So, if a person wanted to be adopted, if there was a desire to adopt a person from another family into that family, and especially with sons, again, this is a very patristic society, with sons, it was a huge deal. They would go to the Roman praetor, the official who oversaw this sort of thing, and there would be a copper scale set up. And the adoptive family would be here, and the father only. They didn't care what the mother thought. And the father that was giving the son up, or the family giving the son up for adoption, would be here. And they would symbolically place weights in the scales. And each time the weight would fall, the first 2 times, on the side of the family from whom the son or daughter was coming. The adoptive father was not able to buy them. The father, or this family, was able to buy them back. The scales would tip that way twice. On the 3rd attempt, they would change the weights. The scale would fall. Now the adoptive family has purchased this person, and the father can't purchase them back. That was the beginning of the process. Then they would go before the praetor, and the adoptive parent would have to plead for why this adoption should happen. They'd have to demonstrate their case and say, well, this is why this child should be adopted. And this could go all the way through adulthood. This didn't just happen when you were 12 or 13 or 3. You could be 30 and this could happen. They would plead. And the significance, once the adoption went through and the praetor signed off on it, the significance was it was incredibly significant in that culture. This was all legal. The adoptive son or daughter would lose all rights to the family from which they came. No rights whatsoever. Those family members, if there was an inheritance, too bad. You've made a decision to join this family, so your inheritance now will be with them. And the inheritance in the adoptive family would be absolutely part of that new adopted person's legal right. They now, if you were adopted into a wealthy family, and even if there were other children in the home, you had every right to that inheritance just like the birth children did. Complete rights to the inheritance. And if subsequent births took place, it didn't matter. You lost nothing. That inheritance was still yours. The old life that you had in the family from which you came. Let's say, for instance, you were a son or a daughter and you owed huge debts. They're just wiped out. All the creditors to whom you owed, they're tough, because now you're a new person in a new family, and all of those debts have been wiped out completely. And in the law's eyes, you are now the son or daughter of this new father. Now you think, gosh, that's interesting. What does that mean? It means a lot. As a matter of fact, this happened to a very important person. Emperor Claudius had a daughter named Octavia. Nero was adopted into that family so that Claudius would have a successor to the throne, because he didn't have a successor. Nero fell in love with Octavia and wanted to marry her, but he could not, because he had been adopted into that family. He had to go before the Senate and have legislation passed so that he could marry Octavia, even though Octavia was no relative of his at all. That's how seriously they took this. There had to be 7 witnesses to the adoption. Do you know why that was? Because then if the family that adopted this son or daughter, and there was some question as to the inheritance, there were 7 witnesses available, even if the parents were long dead, to say, no, we saw it. They're entitled to everything that they're supposed to get. Now, that's what Paul's thinking about when he says adoption here. He's not thinking about what we think about. We take that so much more lightly in that sense. He's thinking about something very different. And every step of this, Paul is thinking about with regard to redemption. He's making an application here. For instance, once sin was our father. We were owned by sin in that legal sense. We were owned. God, through a payment that was made, tipped the scales in favor of the adoptive family, which is God Himself. The Spirit is our witness. Jesus is our advocate in this. So it's not just an empty thing that takes place secret, but inside of us it is something that is actually happening in a transaction between ourselves and God that is as official as any adoption could be. The past debts of sin are all wiped out. Clean. They're done. We can't be held responsible before God for the past anymore. Wow. And we become members, and Paul makes that case of Jesus' inheritance once we're adopted into this family. So this is literally the picture of us becoming part of God's family. And it's nothing of us. We didn't deserve it. It's just that God wanted us. That means a lot to me. I don't know about you, but it means a lot to me. And Paul continues this and he says, He gives us the Spirit that cries out, Abba. Now, I remember my son, who's not here, and so I can freely use him as an illustration today since he's not going to be embarrassed by it. I remember, although he'll get on YouTube maybe and hear the sermon and then he will be embarrassed, I don't know. But I remember when at 5 months, when he first started to try words out. And one of the first words he learned was truck. And then one of the earliest words he learned was daddy. All right? The toddler's cry for the father is what Abba is. That's what it means. It's not some weird Greek word that is some significant, with all kinds of history behind it. It is literally the cry of a toddler toward the father in a moment of desperation. That's what it means. That was the term used. And so it explains to me, it's not thought through. It's just, Daddy, help me. Jesus used this term. This is very significant. And if you get a Greek New Testament, it'll be made plain. Some translations may have it in the liner notes. I don't know. But I can tell you in the Greek New Testament, when Jesus teaches about prayer, Abba, who is in heaven. We read our Father. It's not what Jesus said. He used this term. And when Jesus is in the garden pleading for God to provide another way, Abba. Nobody in the history of the world, think of this, prior to Jesus had ever referred to the Supreme Being with that toddler's phrase. Ever. Ever. It had never happened. Now this passage goes further. Paul speaks about the whole universe groaning. I can't imagine a more significant passage to me. I have used this passage in funerals, numerous funerals, because for me, and maybe I'm the only one, this passage brings me a sense of comfort when I look at what's going on in the world. That the whole universe is groaning, not just me, not just you, not just the sentient creation, but the entirety of the universe is messed up. And it is groaning as if in childbirth, awaiting the day of the Lord. What does that mean? Well, evil and trouble are just gratuitously present everywhere unless I understand that things are not the way they're supposed to be. That's what's known in theological studies as a theodicy. A theodicy is a way by which we take God's goodness, His omnipotence, and we couple it up to the fact that there is evil. There is suffering. How do we make those pieces fit? This passage is one of them. The whole creation is groaning as if in childbirth. That's why when we go to a funeral, there's a part of us, I'm a Christian, you're a believer, we all say, oh, the person is, if they could come back, and we say this, they could come back and speak to us, they'd say, don't be sad for me. And that's true, but we are sad. Why? We use words like it's wrong. There's something wrong with the fact that this person has left this world. We're right about that. We're right about it. That's why it hurts, because it is true. There is something wrong with this moment in which this person I care about is no longer here. This passage brings significance to the human experience that goes wildly beyond anything that we really get in touch with as human beings. That's why I remember my grandfather sitting across from me one time, and he was dying. This is my grandfather on my mother's side. Granddaddy Bill, who was the most optimistic person I have ever known. Everything was just, possibilities that was his way of thinking about everything. And he was dying. And he just looked at me and he said, everybody's got to die. That's just part of living. That was his attitude toward it. But that's not the way in which we look at it. We in the West do not do death very well. We tend to take the person who is leaving us and cling to them with all of our might. And these passages, for some of us, I have a friend of mine who lost his wife very recently. We were sitting there. He looked at me as though I would know. He said, "Rip, why do you think God took her from me?" And I said, "He didn't take her from you." I said, "The creation isn't the way God intended it to be. We were never meant to leave this world in this way at all, but now we do." And I said, "One day you will see her again, if I'm to believe the Bible." And the degree to which we can receive that truth, that the world is messed up, that God didn't intend these things to be this way, is the degree to which it'll bring comfort to us to know it. But there's something beside that as well. Even if we can't grasp it, it doesn't change the truth of it at all. That's important.
That's comfort.
That is comfort. There is one for whom the truth is known, whether we can accept it or not. And when you think about it that way, that's really all that matters, no matter what kinds of things. This is why when people drift away from the Lord and things happen in their lives and they make bad decisions and we get very concerned about it, and rightly so, there's an element to which I say, God is watching over this. This isn't something that's just God's going, "Oh, did you see that? I didn't know that was going to happen." That's not the way it is. So whether we can accept those truths or not, they are truths. And I'm very thankful for that. Paul says that nature has been subjected to futility. What does that mean? Well, science tells us these days that if the universe continues, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, whether you understand these things or they're important to you, maybe they're not. They're kind of important to me. I like this sort of stuff. The universe has been expanding since it boomed into existence. And it's actually expanding faster and faster. And that if this present trend continues, there will come a day, let's hypothetically say we would still be here as a human race, where we will look up in the sky and see absolutely nothing. Because everything will have spread so far apart and is expanding away from us at such a high rate of speed that even the light from those objects can't reach us. They might as well not be there. Do you know, if you look up right now tonight, you go up and you look up at Regulus, a star. It's a star. Mm-hmm. You are seeing light that is from 1.5 million years ago. That's how Regulus looked 1.5 million years ago. It might not even be there now. And we would have no awareness of that because of the distances involved. The universe continues to expand, and pretty soon all the objects are so far apart that even the particles themselves of which the universe is composed are so distant from one another, there's no heat, no light, no energy, just cold, dead nothingness drifting into the eternity. That's futility. And you and I are part of that futility unless there's a God who oversees that. See, this is where the cosmologies get us into trouble, because the science is there, but it discounts one thing. is they're a supervisor of the signs, as we understand it. But think of it this way. Nature didn't have anything to say about that. You and I do. Nature, the fact that it's being subjected to that futility, the rocks, the trees, the stars, the sun, the moon, the planets, they don't have anything to say about that futility. You and I do. H.G. Wells said this. He said, humanity, H.G. Wells was an antagonist to Christianity, by the way, and he said this. G.K. Chesterton, the Christian author, spoke against H.G. Wells a lot. He said this, humanity who began in a cave behind a windbreak will end in the disease-soaked ruins of a slum. Now, if Paul's wrong, that's right. You and I will live, come into the world, spend our time here, and become potting soil, and that's the end of it. That's futility. But it's not true. Jesus in the garden looked at the maker of the universe and called him Abba, Daddy. Do we really believe, as we sit here today, that God will provide the grace that we need in the moment that we actually need it? Or do we believe that things are just out of control? That cry, Abba, is not a reasoned, thought through, let me give you all of the theological details about who God is and why you should trust Him. It is a reflexive cry. It's the toddler who sees a big dog and runs up and grabs Daddy's legs and hides with no pretense of sufficiency. That's the spirit that God has placed in you and me. God will take us to the place of safety. He will. He has promised to do it. I don't know where everybody is today, but if there's anything about which I've said, you have a question, you want to speak with me, pray with me after the service, talk to me about this church, I'll be glad to stay as long as it takes.